closer look at a period in our history both maligned and misunderstood.
Call it the original Great Escape. On May 13, 1862, just over a year into the Civil War, an enslaved man named Robert Smalls, who labored on a Confederate steamer in South Carolina's Charleston Harbor, set into motion a daring plan.
He saw that the Confederate crew had left, and he knew that oftentimes they left for the evening, not to come back until the next day.
As his great-great-grandson Michael Bulwer Moore explains, for Smalls and 6 other slaves and their families, the stakes couldn't have been higher.
They knew that if they got caught, that they would be not just killed, but probably tortured in a particularly egregious and public manner.
Disguising himself in the top hat and long overcoat of a Confederate captain, Smalls piloted the ship past Fort Sumter towards the Union blockade and freedom.
It really blew people's minds because, it just was beyond what people thought an enslaved person could do. So many twists and turns in the story that would be just amazing.
And how about this for a second act? After returning home to Beaufort, South Carolina, Robert Smalls was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, one of more than a dozen African Americans to serve in Congress during the period known as Reconstruction, when the formerly rebel states were reabsorbed into the Union and 4 million newly freed African Americans were made citizens.
It was a time of unparalleled hope.
Gates says Reconstruction is one of the most misunderstood chapters in American history.
Black men could vote, and they were about to elect congressmen to represent them throughout the South.
I mean, you go and you ask people on the street who the first black person was elected to the U.S. Congress, they're going to guess it's the 1960s, the 1970s.
And they would never guess it was Hiram Revels from Mississippi.
Hiram Rhodes Revels was born free and served as a chaplain to black regiments during the Civil War. On February 25, 1870, he was sworn in as a senator from Mississippi, an office once held by Jefferson Davis, who left the Senate to become president of the Confederacy. Is this a big national moment?
Oh, it's a historic moment, and it's memorialized in the famous Currier and Ives lithograph that shows the first senator and members of the House of Representatives who were African Americans.
The famed printing house created this lithograph featuring the African American members of Congress, all of them Southerners, all of them Republicans, in 1872.
Wow, look at that.
Harvard University's Houghton Library houses one of the few known copies.
When Frederick Douglass saw the portrait of Hiram Revels, he said, at last the black man is represented as something other than a monkey.
So some of these men, 7 years before, are slaves.
That's right, absolutely. There were only 2 of these men who were born free.
It's the first time in this country, or really anywhere, that an interracial democracy was created.
Columbia University historian Eric Foner estimates that about 2,000 African Americans held some kind of public office during Reconstruction.
We tend to think of slaves as ignorant or unsophisticated, but they had been living in American society for their whole lives, and their parents had too. The slave trade from Africa had ended long before. These people were Americans, and they wanted the same rights, the same opportunities as free white people had.
How gutsy was it for these guys not just to try to be elected, but to get seated and to actually demand equality?
Lawrence Otis Graham wrote a book about Mississippi Senator Blanche K. Bruce, who was born a slave in Virginia before becoming a successful plantation owner in Mississippi. Bruce and his wife Josephine were one of the wealthiest African-American couples in America and lived in this townhouse in an integrated Washington, D.C. neighborhood.
This is not someone who was in over their head. This was someone who, despite all the odds against him, succeeded enormously.
The year he's seated in the Senate, 1875, is the apex of black representation during Reconstruction. 7 House members and 1 senator. So that's the high point.
Yeah, no, it is. And so, but he doesn't get to enjoy that high point very long with his colleagues.
When neither candidate in the 1876 presidential election secured enough votes in the Electoral College to be declared winner, a deal was struck. Southern Democrats agreed to back Republican candidate Rutherford B. Hayes. In exchange, the federal troops who had protected black voters were withdrawn from the South. Black voting rights were gradually stripped away, and black representation in Congress faded. Reconstruction was over, and the Jim Crow era of segregation began. For most of the 20th century, Reconstruction was portrayed as a failure. This is how the South Carolina state legislature was depicted in D.W. Griffith's 1915 The Birth of a Nation. That movie, which cast the Ku Klux Klan as heroes, was a sensation with white audiences. President Woodrow Wilson even hosted a screening at the White House. And most schools taught Reconstruction as a misadventure at best.
That's what I was taught in high school in the 1950s. Reconstruction was the worst period in American history. It was a travesty of democracy. Black people misused the right to vote, were not capable of serving in public office. That was taught everywhere.
For a young Henry Louis Gates, this was particularly painful.
And the few black kids in my class would put the textbook up over our face and slink down in our chairs because it was all so embarrassing.
But over the last 25 years, Reconstruction in some schools has been given a much fuller treatment.
As soon as African Americans have the right to vote, they become a majority in several southern states.
And in 2017, the Reconstruction-era National Monument was established in Robert Small's hometown of Beaufort, South Carolina. Just down the road, you can see the house he lived in as a free man and the church he attended. Alongside it is a bust of Smalls, the only known statue in the South of any of the pioneering black congressmen of Reconstruction.
They were no different than other congressmen. They weren't all great geniuses, and they weren't rabble like you saw in Birth of a Nation. Well, I think the black congressmen are worth studying not only in their own right, but as symbols of a very big effort in our history to make this an interracial democracy.
Supremacist groups, including the KKK and neo-Nazis, have evolved their methods of congregating and spreading their messages significantly since the days of burning crosses and wearing white hoods. While these overt displays of hate still occur, they are less common and more likely to be met with swift condemnation and legal action. The primary methods these groups use today are just as modern. Platforms like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter or X as it has become, WhatsApp, and YouTube have been instrumental in spreading extremist ideologies. These groups often create closed groups or use algorithms to avoid detection. Websites like 4chan and 8chan have become breeding grounds for hate speech and extremist conspiracy theories. Fox News, QAnon, OAN are the traditional means. Apps like Telegram and Discord provide private spaces for extremist groups to communicate and organize. Many white supremacist groups have their own websites and blogs where they disseminate their propaganda. Podcasts have become a popular medium for spreading extremist ideologies, allowing listeners to consume content at their convenience. Platforms like Twitch and Rumble have been used by white supremacists to stream live content, often featuring hateful rhetoric and conspiracy theories. Infiltration of mainstream culture. Extremist groups often infiltrate mainstream political movements and organizations to spread their message. Some groups appropriate symbols and cultural elements from mainstream society to make their ideologies more appealing to a wider audience. Infiltration of educational institutions. Extremists may attempt to infiltrate schools and universities to indoctrinate young people. While these events are often met with counter-protests and law enforcement intervention, they can still be effective in raising awareness of extremist ideologies. Extremist groups may organize networking events or conferences to connect with like-minded individuals. Some groups may attempt to engage in community outreach efforts to build support for their cause. It's important to note that these methods are not mutually exclusive, and extremist groups often employ a combination of these and ever-changing strategies to maximize their reach and impact.